Good morning. Welcome. It is good to be upright, standing straight up. If you weren't here a couple weeks ago, I was supposed to preach 3 weeks ago and made it to the front door, but could not make it to the car. Sent Mike Maglish my notes for the sermon, and he looked over them for a few minutes and preached my sermon. It was different sitting at home watching online, your sermon being preached to you, a lot of your words, but he did a great job. So we're really glad you're here. Welcome those that are online. Thank you for tuning in with us. And for those joining us later on in the week, because you couldn't do it on a Sunday. So we are in a series called Misquoted, and this is a good series, really good. And I'm excited about sharing today Eye for an Eye, Tooth for Tooth. Ray Stedman, some of you guys may have heard of the guy named Ray Stedman. He tells a story of two soldiers that were living in Korea years and years ago during war times. They had lived off base, they'd lived in their own rented quarters, and they decided to hire a young Korean boy to do their cooking and their cleaning. This is something that happens overseas. Like you have more money, it goes farther. So they had somebody do the cooking and cleaning, but these two soldiers, they were pranksters. They liked to have fun at other people's expense. And so they decided they would prank the very guy that fixed their food and cleaned their house. And so they would put like Vaseline on the handles of the stove and then watch him fumble with those as he tried to turn it on. And they put a bucket, the old trick bucket over the doorway, so when you walked in, it got knocked on him and he was soaking wet. And then they nailed his shoes to the floor as well. I haven't tried that one, but nailed his shoes and then thought it was funny. The crazy thing about this boy is that it didn't change the boy's behavior. He just quietly went about his business, fixing the food for these two young soldiers and cleaning the house. And it kind of got to these soldiers of like, we gotta stop doing this. They felt guilty for what they had done because the guy didn't change his behavior. And so they sat down with him and said, you know what, we're sorry. I mean, we just like pranking and it's all been on you, but we're sorry. We're not gonna do that anymore. And so the young Korean boy says, in his broken English, he says, so no more sticky on the stove? And they're like, no more, we promise. Because no more water over the doorway? He says, no, not gonna do that. No more nails, no more shoes nailed to the floor? He says, no, not gonna do it anymore. He's like, okay, no more spit in soup. You got to be nice to people that fix your food. It's even today. You go out to eat, and you're going to make a big stink about your food. You don't know what they did to it. All right? Revenge. We like revenge sometimes, don't we? No. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, if you're from the South. No, that was I shouldn't have said tooth for tooth. It'd be teeth for teeth. I haven't preached for a while, so I got to be really careful. So what does this mean, this whole phrase, eye for eye? What do people think it means? I think they think it means this: permission to seek revenge. Not permission just to seek revenge, but permission to seek, that the Bible gives you permission to seek revenge. After all, it says eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Well, fill in this blank for me. Revenge is sweet. It's not nice, thank you. You're jumping to the end of my sermon. Revenge is sweet. Or I don't get mad, I get even. Yeah. So do you ever do the whole eye for eye, tooth for tooth in your own life? And why do we do that? Why do we do that? Part of it comes from a good place. Like we want justice to happen. We want somebody to pay. That wasn't right. What you did to me wasn't right. Now, I don't watch baseball much. To me, I won't describe it. But anyway, Andre Dawson, anybody know that name? He used to play for the Cubs. Yeah, 2 people know Andre Dawson anyway. So he played for the Cubs back in the day, and he got really ticked because he was up to bat, and his last strike that came across, he's like, that is not a strike. Called it a strike. Andre went nuts. Uncharacteristic of Andre, starts yelling at the yelling. He gets thrown out of the game. He's still not done yelling. He goes to the bench, grabs bats. I watched the video this week. Throws bats out onto the field twice, yelling at the umpire. Of course, you get fined when you do that stuff in sports. But if you make too much of a stink after you've been fined, you could get fired. So what Andre did was he had to pay a fine, anywhere from $500 to $1,000. I had mixed reports that I read. And so on his check, maybe to the MLB, Major League Baseball, to MLB, $1,000. Memo, donation to the blind. Do you get that? All right? All right, the umpire was blind. You know, he's making it. Yeah. We do eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. We do. We may not say it, but subtly, we want to pay people back. And somehow, we have permission from the Bible because we got a verse that actually says, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Now, we're gonna look at the context of this because that context is the key, right? To all these verses that these misquotes we've been talking about. Look at the Bible, what's happening before it, what's happening after it, and maybe we'll find out what it really means. We're going to find out that the eye for an eye and tooth for tooth is a law in the Old Testament, and it is a good law. But it's from God, and it's to benefit God as He teaches people how to be good to one another, and when bad things happen, how to be fair and consistent. It doesn't mean that we use the law to our own benefit. For that matter, we don't use any of the Bible to benefit just ourselves. This is where a lot of these quotes come from, to benefit ourselves. Let's look at it. The context of Exodus chapter 1 is where we're going to go. So turn in your Bibles, if you would, to Exodus chapter 1. Or if you have the LifeSpring app, you can hit sermon notes on that front page, and it'll take you to the scripture. Exodus 21, verses 22 to 27. Now, before I read that, I want to give you the context of Exodus, okay? Exodus, God's people, His Jewish people, are being called out of Egyptian slavery. They've been in slavery for how many years? Approximately 400 years, good. And they're being led out by Moses into the wilderness. And the Bible talks about the fighting men were numbered. And there were 600,000 fighting men, okay? Not counting the ones that weren't fighting men. I don't know. But 600,000. And if each of them was married and had one kid, how many people we got going into the wilderness now? Over 1 million, let's just say, so we don't have to do math, all right? Over 1 million people are going to go into the wilderness, and they're going to live together for not 2 years. They make it to the promised land in 2 years, but they don't have the faith to go into the promised land. Remember at Kadesh Barnea, and they're going to, there's giants in the land, we can't do that. And they listen to the 10 spies and not the 2, Joshua and Caleb. And so they're wandering around for another 38 years, living in tents. And I'm telling you, you can't even live with your own family without it being intense, right? It's tough. It's tough being married, tough having kids, it's tough having families. But 1 million in the desert with no water and no food at times. There's got to be some rules. And so the context of this is God giving them rules that when they're camping next to their tending buddies, that when they start getting in fights, that they know what to do when bad things happen. Okay, so let's look at it. Exodus 21, verse 22, starting. This is the context of eye for eye, tooth for tooth. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman, so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him. But he can't just make up a price. Okay? I'm going to take your tent, all your possessions, your inheritance. I'm going to take everything. He can't do that. It's got to be that the judge determines that that's correct. Look at the last part. And he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there's harm to what? What's that? The baby. The baby. In this context, the baby. You shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, now we're talking literally eye for eye, tooth for tooth, in the context. Strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. Now, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Are we talking literally or figuratively in Exodus chapter 21? I think a little bit of both, all right? Because you got the pregnant lady that gets hit inadvertently, and you've got the slave that an eye was poked out or a tooth was knocked out. So, context is everything in understanding these phrases, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So the next time somebody says that, well, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, kind of give themselves permission from the Bible to get revenge, you can just say, what happened to the pregnant lady? I mean, really. Like, so was the baby okay? And they're going to look at you like, what are you talking about? I'm just trying to get back at my neighbor. You know, when you're talking amongst your HOA buddies, because everybody's friends with HOA, right? Everybody gets along. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. I have a right. There's justice. What happened to the pregnant lady? And they will look at you like you're nuts. But at least you'll be teaching them the context of Scripture, okay? So this context is about two men that are fighting in a scuffle, and a pregnant lady is inadvertently hit during the altercation between these two men, and something happens. All of a sudden, God's law is saying, listen, you're not just responsible for what happens between you and this other man. You're responsible for all the harm that you do that's around you. You know, it's Idaho. A lot of people carry weapons. And you go to these classes. And listen, if you pull out a weapon and you discharge a bullet because you want to defend yourself, you're in charge of wherever any of those bullets go. You're responsible. Well, I was just trying to defend and I missed and I hit somebody else. No, you're held responsible for that. You can see why God gives these laws to this over 1 million people going into the desert to live together. There's going to be, apparently it was a problem of striking somebody's slave. I find it interesting that the slaves that are being released had slaves. But anyway, like different culture, okay? But there's other things that are going on in these scriptures, and it helps to see the context of it. Now, what does this law really mean? I'm going to give you three things of what I believe this law means. The eye for an eye law, and first of all, I believe it's given so that people would be treated fair in their judgments. When there was a judgment made, it needed to be fair for both parties, both the one that was offended and the one doing the offense. Can you imagine the emotion? And maybe some of you can. The emotion that would go on that a guy's wife who's pregnant with their child, that she gets hit in such a way, car accident, a strike to the belly, whatever it is, that the child dies. I can imagine the emotion of having a miscarriage. I can understand that. But someone intentionally, not even intentionally, that it just happened that somebody else caused the baby to die. I mean, the emotion that's wrapped around that is listen, I'm not just going to get mad at you and come after your money and come after maybe your kid, but I want to do the worst thing possible. And you get wrapped up in the emotion, and the emotion takes over, and you don't just eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You go beyond that. And I think this law was given to protect people in that judgment needs to happen, but it can only go so far. It needs to be fair for both the offended and the one that did the offending. Because we want to say, not only are you going to pay me back, but I'm going to go after your whole family. The problem is this thing of revenge, we decide to become the judge. And in our own minds, we are right. Driving the other day, and someone came by me, and they pulled in front of me just And I'm like, they did that on purpose. I was mad. I won't tell you the rest of the story. But later I thought, there was a time that I cut in front of somebody and I did not see them. Matter of fact, I'm like, they pulled out from being parked on the side of the road. And so when I looked, there was nobody there. But then when I pulled over, they pulled out from the side. But still, we want to pay people back. And how many things happen on the roads because we want to pay people back? This eye for an eye, tooth for tooth there is justice. But we got to be careful when we dispense it, when we use it to get our own revenge. We're in trouble when we are the one that's the judge, the jury, and the executioner. See, when you're revengeful and you take it in your own hands, you're not allowing others to look into it and to see that there's still two sides to it. And when emotion gets involved and when your own family gets involved, we can go too far. So God He's being just when He gives the eye for an eye and the tooth for tooth law. I believe this law, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, is also given as a deterrent to evil. It's to slow the evil down. I mean, if you're walking around and somebody's got a patch over his eye, you find out he lost that because he put somebody else's eye out, and the judge said, you're going to lose it. Then you're going to be really careful when you're in a little scuffle with your buddies. And you're going to hurt somebody that's not even a part of it. Or somebody's without a hand. Well, how'd you lose the hand? Well, I stole something the other day and they took my hand. And, well, I might think differently. See, when there's not punishment for something that's done, then people decide, well, there's no consequences. And that's a dangerous place to go. Have you been there? Like, well, it wasn't that bad. You didn't steal too much money. You didn't steal too much stuff from their house. We're not going to do anything. Ever heard of people doing that, states doing that, where they decide we're not going to hand out any punishment to people that steal less than $1,000 worth of stuff from somebody's house? It's happening, guys. It's happening. And when you withhold that, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, then you give people permission. This was given as a deterrent to evil, so that evil doesn't keep going. You got the freedom to choose to go against the law, but there are consequences. And God gave this to these people so that it would deter evil, that evil would not get out of hand. And here, this whole eye for an eye law, it was not given. It was not given to give people license for personal revenge. The law was given so that there would be fair judgments among the Israelites, that they could make it fair. It was not given so that they can have their own personal vendetta against those that did evil against them. So that's the Old Testament. I want to look at how Jesus used this in the New Testament. And we're going to look at, it's not Romans in your outline. It's correct on the slides and on the app, but it's Matthew. In Matthew, in one of the most well-known sermons, Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, in Matthew chapter 5, is going to actually quote from this law in Exodus 21. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. And I'm going to give you the context of what's going on here in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus is taking some time to talk with thousands of people and tell them that how they've understood the law and how they've interpreted it and how they've applied it has been wrong. A lot of it's been wrong. And so he's going through several times where he'll say, well, you've heard it said, don't do this. Well, you've heard it said, don't do that. And so in this case, what we're going to look at here in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, he's going to show that there's a bigger picture and a bigger reason why God gave the Old Testament law. People will use the Bible for their own benefit all the time. God's laws and His word are never to be used for our own selfish gain. And I think that's the heart of Matthew chapter 5 and what Jesus is going to get at as he shares about this passage of Scripture. See, we want to use the Bible to prove that we are right. We want to use the Bible to gain a better following. We want to use the Bible to control people. We want to use the Bible to help make sure that people know that our political view is right and theirs is wrong. We want to draw these lines. We want to be right. God's law was never intended to be used for our own selfish gain, ever. And we do that today, but in Jesus' day, they were doing it there too. And so I think what Jesus has to say about this eye for an eye, tooth for tooth is very applicable today. Verse 38 of Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. Where did these people hear this being said? Who said this in their culture? Who would say it? It'd be the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, Sadducees. Like they would hear this at the temple. They would hear this in the synagogue. You've heard this said when you went to church, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. He says, but I tell you, I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Dr. J. Vernon McGee. Anybody listen to Dr. J. Vernon McGee? I know several people do, but you've told me you do. He tells the story of an Irish man who was once slapped in the face, slapped right across the cheek. And so this Irishman, knowing the Bible, he turned to him the other cheek. And what'd the guy do to him? Slapped him harder, knocked him right down to the ground. And as this Irishman gets up off the ground, he clenches his fist and he just punches the guy back right in the face. And the guy gets knocked to the ground. He's like, what are you doing, man? He's like, well, listen, Jesus told me what to do with the first cheek slap, the second one, but he didn't tell me what to do after that. That makes the point. Well, God didn't say, but we do know what's right and what's wrong. We do know the heart of God. But somehow, we want to justify ourselves when things happen to us. When things happen to us, man, we want to pull out the Bible. When we do things, I'll show you what scriptures to pull out when I do something wrong, okay? Grace, forgiveness, mercy, long-suffering. Come on, fruit of the Spirit, buddy, show it. It's tough. But Jesus says you've heard it said. And listen, the context of Exodus, that's where we're getting this, Exodus 21, verse 24. The context of that is these Jewish people all going into the wilderness to live amongst Jews and a few people that were proselytes, people that weren't Jews, but they had gone with them, okay, maybe slaves of them. Egyptian husbands or Egyptian wives, there's some of those in there. And it told them how to live amongst themselves as a Jewish community. But what's the context of Matthew 5? What are the Jews, who's living around the Jews now? You can say it out loud. Who's living around the Jews now in Matthew 5? Who? The Romans. Yeah, the Romans are living amongst them, okay? They've conquered the whole world. They took over after the Grecian Empire had conquered all. Now the Romans had conquered all, and these Roman soldiers are always about. Like you go down the street, there's Roman soldiers, and they're bossy, and they make them do things for themselves. And the heart of this Matthew 5 is that Jesus is like, hey, the law was given to turn people back to me, to know that there's a right way and a wrong way, to know there's righteousness, and for there to be fair justice. Jews, you know this. It was so that you would know that there was going to be coming a Messiah. And so if you look in Galatians chapter 3, I'll put it on the screen. Now, before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith. How are we held captive by the law or imprisoned? Because everybody has sinned. We all become captive of the law because there's no way out. You sin one time, you're a lawbreaker. Come on, Jews, you're a lawbreaker. Christians, you're a lawbreaker. Now, before faith came, we were held captive by the law until the coming faith would be revealed. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came. Remember, God doesn't want us to just memorize a bunch of rules. He wants to have wisdom to apply truth in situations. It was our guardian until Christ came in order that we might be justified by faith. God uses the law for good. When we use it, we corrupt its intended purpose most of the time. Most of the time we do. And people in Jesus' day had misused, they'd misinterpreted the eye for an eye, tooth for tooth to allow themselves to get revenge on their neighbor. And not just their neighbor, but the Romans as well. We really like it when others get what they deserve. We don't like it when we get what we deserve. You know, the culture there back then, also the Corinthian church had done this. They had decided this eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, that they would hold each other accountable. And so they had people in the church at Corinth, fellow Christians, going to court against one another. Listen to what it says in 1 Corinthians 6, 7 to 8. To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. And the defeat is you don't understand the grace of Jesus. If all you're doing is trying to prove each other right and wrong and hold yourselves eye to eye, tooth for tooth, why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? But you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brothers. They had taken the Old Testament law and they began to say, I have a right to do this. And you know what? They were right. They actually understood Old Testament law. They were right in that there needed to be justice. And let's go to the courts. But Paul was just like, what is this doing to these people that don't know the Lord? They're looking in on the church going, can you guys not solve these problems amongst yourselves? And you're taking each other to court? What's up with that? And so Jesus, in Matthew chapter 5, he gives some illustrations of what he's meaning when he talks about, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. And he says, he gives some illustrations. He says, listen, when somebody is evil to you, don't resist them. If somebody slaps you, turn the other cheek. If someone sues you, then for your tunic, whatever they're suing you for, give them something more. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. I can't overemphasize the context of Matthew 5 in that Jesus is, when he says, when they force you to go 1 mile, go with them 2, Jesus is concerned about the salvation of those that don't know him. And he knows that our behavior amongst ourselves either draws people closer to God or pushes them farther away. That's why he says, when somebody asks you to go a mile, see, in that day, the Romans, you're walking along the street, and a Roman's standing there, and he's got his big old pack, whatever it is, and he's heading to Corinth or whatever, and I guess you'd have to get in a boat to go from Rome to Corinth. Anyway, he's got to make it his way down to the dock, and he's got all this stuff, and he's a couple miles out. He looks at you Jew, and he says, hey, pick up my pack. The law said that you had to take that pack a mile. The Romans had the law. It was for them. You got to take it a mile. So you're like, oh, man, these Romans. I hate these Romans. And you'd carry a mile, and you get to the end of the mile, and it's, boom, there you go. And Jesus is saying, no. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You don't deserve this. You have a right. No. You lay down your rights. You just go another mile. But I have the right. The law says, the Roman law says I don't need to go more than a mile. No, go with them 2. There's something more important than demanding our rights. And here's what I think Jesus is saying. And you can write it down. This is one of our last points. Just because the law gives you the right does not mean you demand your right. Just because the law says it and it's true doesn't mean you demand it. And Paul understood this really, really well. There was nobody in first century besides Jesus that knew the law better than the Apostle Paul. Remember, he was Saul, and he was throwing Christians in prison, and he had studied the law, and he beat his body daily. He's like, man, I'm going to follow the letter of the law. There's nobody better. Philippians chapter 3, verse 6, it's not on the screen, but it said, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. And then he met Jesus. And Paul then began to learn that it wasn't just the law's intent was not for self-benefit. It was to point people to Jesus. The next time you feel those rights being violated, think about, well, the next action that I'm ready to take, is that going to point somebody closer to Jesus or push them farther away? Oh, I don't like that. Hurts. That hurts. But it's really the heart of God. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verse 17, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to what you do, what is honorable in the sight of all. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. That was the turning the cheek, hoping the guy would be like, hit you again? And he'd feel bad. Sometimes they don't get it, all right? But Paul is saying, do this, so that some way they'd wake up to how they're acting. Verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Guys, we do this in the church. We do this amongst ourselves. Somebody doesn't respond the right way in a text. Somebody doesn't acknowledge you, your presence. They look at you the wrong way, or they sit in your seat, or I don't know. And like you just like, and we subtly give eye for an eye, tooth for tooth by, well, I just won't talk to that person anymore. I think I'm just going to avoid that person. And as churches get more and more services, they go, I think I'll go to the 9:15 service. Instead of just saying, man, I got to be kind. So the next time that comes up with you, you're like, you got that feeling coming up. Remember the person's birthday. Send them a card. Or send them a text or an email thing, whatever we do these days. Yeah, and it's just like, whoa, what's this? Somebody's treating me nicely. And maybe they like, I don't even deserve this. And then we begin to not live out this belief that the Bible gives us permission to seek revenge. Here's the takeaway. Instead of revenge, be kind and forgive. That's really easy to do Sunday morning at 11:49. But you guys are going to get in your cars here in about 15, 20 minutes, and you're going to hit the roads, and it's all going to come roaring back to the old self. But God has called us to not live out revenge this way. So let me say don't miss this as you're gathering your stuff to get ready. Don't miss this part, because this does not mean that we never seek justice. So I read an article this lady had written, and there's one paragraph from it that sums up that just because you don't seek your own personal revenge doesn't mean you don't seek justice. Laying aside revenge does not mean we stop seeking justice. Forgiveness does not remove consequences. It does not mean that we don't report a crime, decline to press charges, or refuse to testify in court. When a person's actions have harmed us, themselves or someone else, it is the right for us to take steps necessary so that their actions can be addressed with the appropriate authorities. The difference is that we take action to protect others and do what is right but not for the purpose of doing them wrong. Does that make sense? Like we don't just do it to be vengeful. We do things because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes we give up our right. And we just say, you know what? For the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the good news that Jesus came and died for me too, I'm going to let this thing go. I want to end with a story. It's an amazing story. It happened in fall of 2007. Iranian woman. It's really important that you know where this happened. Samara Alinejad had said that she really wanted revenge. Her son Abdullah was killed in a street brawl when he was only 18. And she knew who killed him. His name was Beilal. The two, barely out of their teens at the time, had played football together, and Abdullah was the second son that this lady had lost. She'd lost her first one when he was 11 in a motorcycle accident. And furious from her grief, she was determined that Baal would hang to death. And in Iran, that was one of the punishments. The offended party was given the right to come up while the person was getting ready to be hung and could kick out the chair to hang the person. And so the boy's pleading for his life, the family's pleading for their boy's life, and she gets up on stage having every right to eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and you're not going to be ready for this, she slaps him across the head, slaps him, and then turns and pardons him and walks off. True story. And I hear that, and I'm like, she had every right, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. I don't know if she knows Jesus. They read the Quran before they were going to hang the guy. I don't know if she was a Christian, but she showed that she understood there was a love from God that was amazing, that would put grace and mercy over the fact that she needed vengeance for her son's death. And I think about the times where I dish out eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and it's not my son that was killed. I just got cut off in traffic. Or a spouse did something to you, or your kid didn't get played in the football game or the basketball game, and I'm thinking, man, I want to point people to Jesus, and there's so many times I haven't.